It says, Remembrance honours those who serve to defend our democratic freedoms and way of life. Those democratic freedoms we fought for include the right to protest. And it was the Nazis who used bans to end protest.
Set out for me why you think it's so important that these protests are allowed to take place next weekend.
Well, first of all, let me say my organisation, War on One, we were founded by the generation that went through war and said after the horrors of that the only war worth fighting was the war against poverty. And I think it's important first to deal with some actual facts. There is no march on Remembrance Sunday. The march is on Saturday and goes nowhere near the cenotaph at all. And it's also important for us to recognise where this story first came about. It came from pro-Nazi groups, the very people we fought against in the Second World War, who tried to incite violence and call for attack on Muslims. And it's deeply disturbing that our government has picked up that call and I think and making very divisive comments. And on Saturday, as we know, football matches will take place. The Lord Mayor of London will host a festival in central London, and London will carry on shopping. I've not yet heard the government calling for those to be banned. So let's be clear.
I mean, those are very different events, though, aren't they? I mean, as you admit, a demonstration...
Not, because this is an attack on some very cherished democratic rights. Look, if you look at the British Royal Legion, which, of course, organises a Remembrance Sunday, it says, Remembrance honours those who serve to defend our democratic freedoms and way of life. Those democratic freedoms we fought for include the right to protest, and it was the Nazis who used bans to end protest.
Right.
And it goes on.
You're not really comparing government ministers to Nazis here, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that actually the idea that on Remembrance Sunday, the very values we fought for are the ones that this government says we must restrict the right to protest. Look, I've just literally come from watching the dead bodies of children filling the front of a hospital in Gaza. Israeli bombs hit the front of that hospital, then an ambulance convoy taking severely wounded to the Rafah crossing. So far, close, just under 9,500 people have died, half of them children, in Gaza. And overwhelmingly, the British people, 76% of them, see the horrors of what is taking place and are calling for ceasefire. And what's more fitting on Armistice Day, because does the government actually know what that means? It commemorates the cessation of war, when we remember the horrors of war, the loss of life, and commit ourselves that their sacrifices will not be in vain.
Well, let's put that to John Hayes, who's a Conservative MP. So John Hayes, for Conservative MP and former Security Secretary. So John, what could be more fitting? A march to call for peace on Armistice Day. What is wrong with that?
We don't do marches and protests on Armistice Day for obvious reasons. It's a time for quiet reflection. It's a time to commemorate, thank, in retrospect, those who pay the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. Now, the freedom they fought for, of course, is the freedom to make your voice heard, to protest. But there are times and places, there are appropriate ways of doing these things. As I said, this is a sacred time for quiet reflection.
Well, Asad Rehman, I think you were not on the line when he was talking just now, but he was saying that banning protests, legitimate right to protest, is the kind of thing the Nazis would do. What's your response to that?
Well, that's the kind of it doesn't pay to use exaggerated terms and references of that kind.
Well, the Home Secretary has talked about hate marches. That's an exaggeration, isn't it?
Well, let's be clear. We have limits on protest in this country. You can't incite hatred, you can't incite violence, you can't incite terror. Those things are against the law. So the right to peaceful protest, the right to make your voice heard, is very important to us. It's a legal entitlement, which we value very much because we're British. Most countries in the world don't have it, of course. But that doesn't mean you can incite violence or terror. That's been long the case, so there's no change here.
Well, let me bring back Asad Rehman to answer that point.
Please do, because I'd like him to answer the challenge.
Yeah. Look,
he should be reflecting firmly, not shouting loudly.
Sure. Look, my grandfather fought, as did 2.5 million Indians and Africans who answered the call to defend Britain. And many of those marching are the children and the grandchildren of those veterans. And it's exactly because of their sacrifices that it's unconscionable that the government and now attacks veteran families from wanting to end the horrors of Gaza. And we have to remember that after the sacrifice of our soldiers, the world said never again and wrote rules to protect civilians, outlawing use of hunger as a weapon of war, being clear that hospitals and schools shouldn't be targeted, and opposing the collective punishment of civilian population. And I think that is the greatest sacrilege, that we're allowing these war crimes to take place and tarnishing the sacrifices of the past generations made. And I think it's in honor of that actually people marching for peace, so the government should be supporting that and should recognizing that actually it's a legitimate right. It is in no way is it problematic for Remembrance Sunday itself. It's no way problematic for the 2-minute silence on the 11th minute of the 11th hour on the 11th day. None of those things are affected at all.
Right.
So then we have to ask ourselves, why is it that they're actually attacking this protest? Is it because the government is committed in supporting Israel in these war crimes, and it's out of step with the British public?
So,
and
John, if you could answer that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I respect what your
Asad Rehman.
Other contributors. Yeah, Asad's grandparents. My father fought in the last war, so I don't. We've all got our stories to tell about that. Fought for 6 years as conscript, fought at Alamein, Tobruk, Monte Cassino, Anzio, and so on. And I was at a meeting of veterans in my constituency this very afternoon. So I'm intimately involved in representing veterans' interests and paying tribute. But just reflect on this. We had protests recently where the cenotaph designed by Edwin Lutyens in memory of the glorious dead, including in the wonderful Indian Army, who was so proud of our empire, which they fought for at that time. We had protests on the steps of the cenotaph. That really isn't appropriate. This is a sacred space.
But Sir John, the protests are not going near Whitehall as currently envisaged. So isn't the Prime Minister trying to ban something that isn't actually taking place?
Well, they did go near Whitehall. And the point I was making is that people clearly didn't have much respect then for the cenotaph, that they were prepared to prop things up against it and wave flags and make speeches next to that war memorial, for that's what it is.
Well, Asad Rehman,
they didn't show much respect then.
Yeah, isn't that the point?
They didn't show much respect then.
Under the new Public Order Act, police can preempt disruption to shut down protests. And even under previous legislation, the Home Secretary could ban protests if the Met believed there was a disorder risk. So, Asad, it's entirely within the rights of the police and the government to act preemptively, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. You have to give due, there has to be due reason, and you have to show that. You can't just have the government or the police deciding willy-nilly to ban any protest that it wants to. That is a cherished freedom. It has to demonstrate that. Look, 2 weeks ago, nearly 500,000 people marched. There was a handful of arrests. That's less than that take place at any given day on any given football match. We don't say let's ban all football matches. This is a democratic right that people should have. And the reason why people are marching is because people are being killed as we speak every single day. So it's absolutely right that people should come out on the streets and express their view. And that's a democratic right and a democratic freedom we should cherish. And we should be really, really careful when a government decides arbitrarily to ban protests because it doesn't like those protests.
So, John, these are marches for peace. They're not hate marches. Would you distance yourself from the description the Home Secretary has used?
Absolutely not. I think that there was hatred on display. There was certainly intemperance, and actually much more than that. There were people shouting jihad. Jihad is being used to commit terrorist atrocities and murders across the globe. You can't allow that to continue. But there's a more fundamental point here. The more fundamental point. Regardless of what this protest is about, and there will be people with strong views on this subject, I respect that. And I certainly respect the right to peaceful protest, as I've already said. Remembrance Sunday is not the time. We have 365 days in the year. Why choose this one?
Asad, if you could answer that point and the jihad point, if you could answer the point about jihad. There were hateful messages at those marches.
Well, first, let's deal with the actual more important point. It's not just randomly chosen as a day. It's chosen because as we watch, the world community watches, innocent men, women, and children are dying. And they're dying on our television screens. And our government has not said and not called for a ceasefire, despite every single humanitarian organization, from Save the Children, UNICEF, to every human rights organization, from Amnesty to Human Rights Watch, to every humanitarian aid agency, from Oxfam to the UN General Assembly, to the UN Secretary General, to even the British public, saying enough is enough. We have to stop these killing of civilians. That's why people are marching, because if we don't march, that 9,500 people will become 20,000 people. Then it becomes 30,000. At what point do we say enough is enough? That's why people are taken to the street, because our political leaders are not listening to ordinary citizens. They're not listening to the British public. Then on the second point of the jihad, I have to say, you know, I have heard many, many disingenuous comments made about that protest, which was incredibly diverse, had families, people from the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Christian community, people of no faith. It was incredibly powerful voice calling for peace.
But there were people calling for jihad, and there were people with parachutes on their, you know, symbols to
look. You know, two idiots who might have some thing on their jackets does not speak for 500,000 people. That's like me saying that the Brexit marches, you know, was all full of neo-Nazis because they had some of the Britain First on it. It's just disingenuous. This is the expression of people, and it should be respected, and it should be listened to and heard. And we cannot say that when we were told that horrors are taking place, that we sat at home and did nothing.
So, John, very quick final thought from you, out of fairness.
Protest about this.
Well, I've made my position perfectly clear.
Right.
I think the Home Secretary is absolutely right on this. Of course it's right. People should be able to express their opinion. I mean, I hope we all recognise how lucky we are to live in this country, where you can do that. There has to be a question asked when protests are suggested about what their likely repercussions or consequences might be. And on this sacred special day, I don't think it will be appropriate to let a march go ahead or a protest go ahead, the consequences of which we cannot predict. And given what happened at the last protests, they would be really quite unacceptable and worse.